Sorry for the slight delay, just a little mix-up in communication. We're set to go. My name is Dick Clark, and I chair the curriculum committee for the Emeritus Students College of Marin, ESPON. It is going to be my privilege to introduce the introducer today, but first I've been asked to do just a couple of things. First one is, it would help us to know if we had some sense of how you became aware of the program today. And I would ask that if you became aware of this and came here because you saw it there, and you saw it in the book passage, monthly magazine, would you raise your hand? Marion, you get a quick count. Right. Just checking. And if perchance you saw it in the College of Marin's Community Education brochure that goes out on a regular basis to every household in Marin, yeah. And if you saw it in the Marin IJ, is that why you're here today? Don't be afraid to raise your hand. Just get this done quickly. And finally, if you saw it in a communication from ESPON, from the Emeritus Students Program, would you raise your hand? Okay, thank you very much for doing that. One last message. At the conclusion of today's presentation, don't leave your seats, those of you who have one. All the seats distributed? Anyway, don't lose your seats, because there have been some pre-selected seats, and if you happen to be sitting in one, you will get a free copy of Michael Krasny's book. So don't leave after all of the questions have been answered and Michael sits down and starts signing books. He will be here. For those of you who have already purchased the book, it's a great gift to give to someone else if you get the free one. So now it is indeed my honor to introduce the person who is going to be introducing our speaker today. It is indeed an honor to call to the podium Dr. David Wayne Kuhn, President and Superintendent of the College of Marin.
Thank you, and welcome. First of all, I want to just take a moment to thank you for your patience as we figured out the logistics. Obviously, this is a good problem to have. Unfortunately, our theater was not available today for this event, but the good news is this. It's a part of Measure B, which we passed, and thanks to all of you. And this past June, we will be building a new lecture hall, which will seat about 250 to 300 people just outside of this. So, thank you. Thank you for your patience. We're going to give Dick credit for the great weather.
You're welcome.
Okay. Do I just need to get closer? I just need to get closer. Is that better? Okay. My apologies. Anyway, I was going to give Dick credit for the weather day, so thank you, Dick, very much. I moved from Seattle 12 years ago, and this week I was actually contemplating moving back. So I'll tell you how much rain we had. So on behalf of the Board of Trustees, the faculty, staff, and students at the College of Marin, we welcome you to our first afternoon author series this spring. And before I introduce our esteemed speaker, I want to take a moment to acknowledge a few people. First of all, we have to express gratitude, we want to express gratitude to the Hattie Fund. Hattie Fund, created by an anonymous donation to the College of Marin, supports the author series. Community education events and activities, like this one, are made possible because generous financial support that the college receives from people like you. Where's Dr. Linda Frank? Any given day, Linda accepts checks. She is our Director of Development, so if you're so inclined, please see Linda. I'd also like to thank Book Passage for collaborating with us on this series and hand-selecting compelling and engaging authors. I'd like to thank the library, and specifically David Patterson over there. David Patterson. Book Passage, a round of applause, both David and the library and Book Passage. Book Passage has been instrumental in helping us host this particular event and the next two, which will be held in the library. Now, that's a smaller space, so you're going to want to get there early for that one too. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge that the Hattie funds for this event were specifically designated for use by our ESCOM program, which is the Emeritus Students of the College of Marin. Emeritus students, raise your hand. All right, give yourselves a big round of applause. ESCOM is designed to serve the unique needs of older adults who are dedicated to the principles of quality of life, lifelong learning, and personal growth. ESCOM partners closely with community education to provide a wide array of classes and events, as well as over 25 clubs and committees. The ESCOM Curriculum Committee has been the driving force behind creating this series and has donated many volunteer hours to ensure these events are well promoted and supported. So again, let's give ESCOM a round of applause. College of Marin Community Education is a co-sponsor of today's event. Each year, over 500 community education courses reach nearly 4,000 students. These not-for-credit offerings are designed to enrich, or are designed for enrichment and enable lifelong learners to take intellectually engaging courses like forensic psychology, international students to study English in an intensive format, and local community members of all ages to take classes in everything from fencing to voice to history. The winter term is already in full swing, that's the good news, but our spring schedule will be available on the Community Education's website beginning next week. And if you live in Marin County, which I think most of you do, you will find it in your mailbox beginning February 24th. So now on to introducing our speaker. Let's give Community Education a round of applause. I'd now like to welcome Michael Krasny to the College of Marin. Dr. Michael Krasny is host of KQED's award-winning Forum, a news and public affairs program that concentrates on the arts, cultural, health, business, and technology. He has been named Best Talk Show Host by Focus Magazine, a number of Bay Area newspapers, the San Francisco Publicity Club, and City Search. Since 1970, he has been a professor of English at San Francisco State University and has taught at Stanford University as well as the University of California at San Francisco. He is a widely published scholar and literary critic, a fiction writer, and a guest and frequent interviewer on the city arts and lecture stages. He is the author of Spiritual Envy, An Agnostic's Quest, and Off Mic, a memoir of talk radio and literary life, and will be sharing his newest book with us today, Let There Be Laughter, a treasury of great Jewish humor and what it all means. Let's welcome Michael Krasny.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and this looks more like a PBS crowd than a College of Marin crowd. No thanks, man. How many are college students here, just out of my own curiosity? Okay, good. I don't know how many of you know this, but I have real roots in this county. I moved out here to be a professor in the early 70s and actually started a radio career at, anybody remember KTIM? Yes. Of course, you local Marin people do. It was a very offbeat, shall we say, alternative culture type of radio station, but it was a wonderful experience for me. I was there for a few years and did a show, believe it or not, called Beyond the Hot Tub. Some of the experiences, in fact, that I had at KTIM written up, and that the president was kind enough to mention it. Stanford Press published called Mike, Memoir of Talk Radio and Literary Life. I do have now a book about Jewish humor, as some of you know, and I'm going to talk about Jewish humor. I thought maybe it might be useful, and by the way, many of you know this voice, but you didn't know this face. I think the voice is preferable. I was going to perhaps begin, before I tell some jokes and talk about Jewish humor, and I hope there's serious interest in Jewish humor. It is something that people kept telling me they need this time. Any of you brazen enough to raise your hand and say you were a Trump supporter? Is that true? You know, it's 8% in San Francisco, those who voted. Marin might even be less than that. Washington, D.C. was half of that. I wound up actually, after doing a lot of book touring, writing a piece, and I thought before I would talk, I might give you a flavor of what I experienced. This is today's issue of The Forward. Now, I don't know how many people from the East Coast know The Forward, but I bet some of you who are West Coast people probably have not heard of it. It's a Jewish newspaper, and it was originally a Yiddish newspaper. How many of you are interested in these kind of arcane connected dots? But the first publisher was Abraham Kahn was the author of a book called The Rise of David Levinsky, which many think is a seminal Jewish novel. And I found out in a talk I gave in Oakland, a woman walked up to me and I mentioned the foreword. I don't remember the context. And she said, "My father was Abraham Kahn." I said, "Oh, it's terrific." And she said, "But my son is Michael Chabon." See the genealogies here, right? All right, so here's what I wrote. I usually don't like to read, but since this came out today, it's a good way to begin and get immersed into what I'm writing about. I begin by writing, I host a live public daily radio show out of San Francisco, city which had a grand total of 8% of its citizens voting for Donald J. Trump. So it was unsurprising that immediately following the election, many in my area expressed gloom about Donald Trump's victory. At events to promote my book on Jewish humor, some audience members said they had come to see me because, given the election results, they felt heartsick, fearful, and desperately needed to laugh. That said, I met some Jews at an Orthodox shul, at a synagogue in Ohio, who championed Trump because they expected him to defend Israel, rip up the Iran nuclear deal, and lean on mishpacha and his Jewish family members. In my book, I write about Jon Stewart actually talking, some of you may know this bit, it's on YouTube, where Jon Stewart talks about how Jewish parents have to rev things up and move faster because they're losing the battle over Easter and Passover. I didn't know that those two were necessarily in battle with one another. But then Stewart went on to show an Easter basket with all the chocolate bunnies and the jelly beans and so forth, and then a Passover Seder plate, which of course has a lamb shake and also horseradish. They expected him to defend Israel, rip up the Iran nuclear deal, and lean on mishpacha. And I mentioned Stewart because he said, "Come on, mishpacha, we have to rev things up here." His Jewish daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner to govern. But far more tribe members feared Trump, seeing him as uninformed, overly nationalistic, autocratic, and uncomfortably cozy with white supremacists. I believe, however, that Jewish humor can serve as a salve for those distressed about the Trump presidency. Jewish humor has sustained its people for centuries through hardship and tyranny far worse than what might emerge from Trump, who I must confess, during the presidential campaign often reminded me, especially in his weird facial expressions, of Benito Mussolini. There was something ridiculous about El Duce, just as there is about the Donald, especially in his nonverbal gestures, vanities, egotism, and thin skin. His potential for abusing power and doing harm remain apparent to many, though others have said, let's give him a chance, and so do his flaws, crudities, and weaknesses. But not long after the Trump presidency was fait accompli, Sarah Silverman tweeted, quote, "Our country is being run by racist, misogynist science deniers who can't see beyond their joyless greed." Then she had, "Have a great Wednesday." Jewish humor has long been a way of releasing anxiety, but also of speaking truth to power and exposing personal failings, absurdities, and hypocrisies of those who wield it abusively. About 200 people walked out of an Amy Schumer comedy performance in Florida right before the election when the comic began to take on Trump, jabbing him as, quote, "an orange, sexual assaulting, fake college-starting monster." Jews have long been touched by the abuses of power and deployed humor as a crucial way of dealing with it. Bill Maher, whose mother was Jewish, though he was raised Catholic, he once claimed he would go to confession with his lawyer, Mr. Cohen, insisted in a play on the Obama birther issue that Trump prove his father was not an orangutan. Trump's non-orangutan paternity had to be proven, Maher reasoned, given Trump's physique, intelligence level, and hair. Additionally, Jewish humor often provides a release, a catharsis, an analgesic to pain and even suffering. Affliction is turned into bitterly funny jokes, like the one in which the doctor told his patient he had bad news. The patient has both cancer and a serious heart condition, but there is good news too, promises the doctor. You're not a hypochondriac. A friend of mine recently told me of a family of Jewish survivors in Holland who had been living there during the Holocaust. They were, like Anne Frank, holed up in a tiny claustrophobic attic enclosure. They had been compelled to dispose of most of their belongings, including nearly all of their many books, but they held on to a few precious personal items, including an oft-read book of Jewish humor, which helped to sustain their spirits during that horrible time. The sad but real fact is that through the ages, Jews have proven to possess the rare ability to make humor out of just about anything as a means of survival. A Jew is told the earth will soon be flooded and all living organisms will drown and die. He says he will begin to study how to live underwater. Jewish humor has a good deal in common with the golem, that magical Jewish folkloric character created from inanimate matter who aggressively took on enemies of Jews and held disasters at bay. After the election, I recall my grandfather's humorous words during the height of the Watergate crisis. I told him of my hope that Richard Nixon would be impeached and replaced by a better, more decent chief executive, one who respected the Constitution. With an ironic lilt to his voice and generations of Jewish history of living under variations of Russian tyranny embedded in his response, he replied, "This hour is bad enough. We need a new one." Okay, that's kind of serious stuff. I know a lot of you are here for the jokes, so I'm not going to tarry on that, but I thought it would be at least instructive. I am, by nature, an educator, to at least read that piece, which, as I said, just came out today. What's been out since the end of September has been this book of mine, and what prompted this book, I'll say this in italics, genesis of this book, as it were, was that I really had established a pretty strong quiver of Jewish jokes, but I didn't want to write just a Jewish joke book. I wanted to, as perhaps literature professors or those who analyze the news, as I do on almost a daily basis, are wont to do, I wanted to go into a kind of deconstructive analysis. What do these jokes mean? Where do they come from? What's the background of them, and so forth. And I had different takes on them than perhaps might be a traditional way of interpreting them. I'll give you a good example, and this is what we call, where I come from, a killer joke. It's a joke that may make you grimace a bit when I first tell it. It may make some of you laugh pretty heartily too. So it's one of these Jewish mother jokes, and there are a lot of them. And I kind of investigated the whole nature of Jewish mother jokes and Jewish American princess jokes. And as a self-declared card-carrying feminist, I wanted to know why, because I think most of these jokes were clearly invented by men. There were so many of them, and why some of them were, by many standards of today, politically incorrect, but nevertheless funny. And let me just take a side departure here to tell you that there were a lot of jokes I had to keep out of here because I'm a public figure and didn't want to push too far the envelope. But there was one that many people said you should have kept in, and why didn't you keep it in there, and so forth. I didn't keep it in there because I think it may be a racist joke on the face of it, but at the same time, it's a funny joke, and it's probably an innocuous joke, so before I go on to tell you about the Jewish mother, I'll tell you this joke. It's about a young woman who goes off to work in the Peace Corps and comes back, or does diligent work in Africa, and comes back with a husband who is a Watusi of about 6'8" in height, with a bone in his nose, and the mother comes out and says, "I said rich doctor." All right. Now, one of those classic jokes that probably should have been included because it was a classic joke. And you run into these problems with changing times and Black Lives Matter and all kinds of phenomena that we see in our present day that cast a different kind of light on these jokes, and they have different meaning, and they evolve, and they have different meaning. For example, a joke which on the face of it may be indicting Jewish mothers and Jewish women is a joke about the man who's dying, and he's on his deathbed, and his daughter is there at the foot of the bed, and suddenly he gets a smell of what we call kugel. Noodle kugel is actually a noodle dish, which is certainly well known among Jewish culinary. And he says, "Just to taste your mother's kugel once before I die. I know I'm going to die, but..." And the daughter says, "Of course, Daddy." She gets up and bounces into the kitchen. And she's gone for quite a while, and he's just barely hanging on by gossamer threads. And she comes back, and she sits down, and she folds her arms. And he can barely even speak at this point. He's at death's door. He says, "Where's the kugel?" She says, "Mom says it's for after." Another version of this one says, "Mom says it's for the Shiva, and the Shiva is where the train is taking place." However, begin to think about and reflect on this joke. It seems to indict, Jewish women as being heartless and all the rest of that. These are Jewish men who make up these jokes, clearly. I mean, that's a foregone conclusion. There's a lot of the aggression in these jokes that I think you have to also take account of. But that joke goes way back to the shtetl in my mind, where women were responsible in large part for putting food on the table. The men were studying the Talmud and the Torah all day. They were living in poverty. There were very few resources in terms of actually making anything even resembling an income, and the women were the responsible ones. They really took the responsibility very seriously and had to be the practical ones. So there's a lot of these jokes that reflect on that if you give them a different cast, like a Jewish woman whose husband dies. He calls up and wants to place an obituary, and they say you have to pay by the word, and she says, "Okay, ward died, Volvo for sale." That's again, kind of a practical sense that in a strange way extols the virtues and just, I suppose, what you could call the resourcefulness of Jewish women. It's in a similar way, the Jewish American princess jokes, which for a while were almost condemned as being misogynistic, being anti-Semitic, and so forth, have a whole other dimension to them as far as I'm concerned, and that is celebrating the success that came in America. Some of them are actually pretty funny. The guy who is married to a Jewish American princess, despite Jewish law forbidding cremation, he asks that he be cremated and his ashes be put in Bloomingdale so his wife will at least visit him a couple times a week. That joke. There's the joke about the Jewish American princess who's holding a vase which is absolutely, unaccountably valuable, and suddenly it slips out of her hands and shatters into many pieces, and what she says is, "I'm all right." Or the three words a Jewish American princess will never hear: "Attention Kmart shoppers." So, these jokes tell us that. I mean, on the one side, they kind of make fun of, and a lot of them are far worse than that, in terms of ridicule and all the rest of it, lampooning, satire, whatever you want to call it. And derogating in some instances, in a kind of what seems like a serious vein. But they elicit laughter, and they also say something about the Jewish men thinking, well, I cosseted, I spoiled, I did all these things for my daughters, they're princesses, but there's a kind of pride in that. There's a sort of sense of almost coming from the shtetl and being able to boast, from being able to lift oneself up and become a success. That boasting used to be something that was not done because there was a great deal of concern that it would only fortify a lot of, shall we say, stereotypes about Jews. But then there became a greater ease about it. And let me show you what I mean by that, and I'll get into a few other ways of illustrating what I'm fleshing out here. This is a joke that appears in my book, and I actually enjoyed creating the narratives in these jokes, because I always wanted to be a novelist and failed, but did write short fiction for a while, and still would like to when the muse calls, which it hasn't recently. But this is a joke, and I just want to pay a little attention, if you would, to the way I've tried to phrase it here, because it's important. Two Texans are sitting on a plane going to Dallas with an old Jewish man sitting between them. The first Texan says, "My name is Roger. I own 250,000 acres. I have 1,000 head of cattle, and they call my place the Jolly Roger." The second Texan says, "My name is John. I own 350,000 acres. I have 5,000 head of cattle, and they call my place Big John's." They both look down at the little old Jewish man who says, "My name is Lenny Leibowitz, and I own only 300 acres. Roger looks down and says, "300 acres? What do you raise?" "Nothing," says Lenny. "Well, then what do you call it?" asks John. "Downtown Dallas." One time, that joke would have been really verboten. It would have been forbidden because, you don't suggest that Jews have power, they have wealth, and they made it, and therefore, one of my African American students said once when I said, "Yeah, Jews have a piece of the pie," it's a mighty big piece of the pie. Those jokes seem to fructify, they seem to, in other words, give credence to those kinds of things. At the same time, we went through a period, remember, of what I call philo-Semitism. I think we're over it now with Steve Bannon and alt-right at the helm and so forth. I think we are maybe in a different era of white supremacists at least being tolerated or coming out from under their rocks. But there was a time when Elizabeth Taylor, some of you recall, converted to Judaism. So did Sammy Davis Jr., so for that matter, Marilyn Monroe, because she married Arthur Miller. And there was not only a kind of philo-Semitism, but kind of welcoming, a lot of it a reaction to the Holocaust, clearly a sympathetic reaction. And suddenly, for a while at least, being Jewish was in vogue. In fact, there was a great joke about Sammy Davis after he converted, because some of you remember he was black and gets on a bus in the South, and the bus driver says, "Get to the back of the bus." This is during Jim Crow segregation. He says, "But I'm Jewish. Get off the bus." That joke kind of tries to memorialize a sense of persecution and the difficulties that Jews have been through. But I think we're past the era of philo-Semitism, and yet there's a great deal more that has gone on with assimilation and acculturation, and Jews being more secular and less identified with the religion itself. As a result, it seems to me you have a lot of jokes that talk about loss, that talk about the loss of piety, of religiosity, of being devoted in ways of observance to the religion, and also losing the identity. There's a famous joke that begins with a young man who buys a Mercedes, and he wants a bracha, which means a blessing, to be said over his Mercedes. So he goes into an Orthodox synagogue, and he asks the rabbi to say a bracha over his Mercedes. The rabbi says, "This is a shotgun. This is a scandal. You should want a bracha said over a Mercedes. First of all, it's a German car. Second of all, it's just a car. You know, brachas are said for special occasions. They're blessings. I don't want to say a bracha over your car." Well, maybe see the conservative rabbi. Maybe he can help you. He's less religious and less subscribing to religious dictates. So he tells him how to get to the conservative synagogue. He goes there, he sees the rabbi, he says, "Can you say a bracha over my Mercedes?" And the rabbi says, "What? I know a lot of brachas, but I don't know any over cars or Mercedes. You really ought to see the Reform rabbi. Let's go down here and take a turn, and you'll be there at the Reform synagogue." He goes there and he says to the Reform rabbi, "I came here to see if you'll say a bracha over my Mercedes." And the Reform rabbi says, "What's a bracha?" It's a joke, but it's also a joke that encapsulates the sense of loss of identity. And, you know, Mercedes and materialism have eroded, you know, that more traditional identity. And I really wanted to get at some of that. It's funny, I did an event in Los Angeles. Anybody remember Bobby Slayton? A stand-up comic who was working out in San Francisco for a number of years, and then he moved to LA. And he had an event at a synagogue in Beverly Hills that was moderated by David Kippen, another name that some of you may know. He was the book editor of the San Francisco Chronicle for a number of years. And he actually did an ongoing conversation just with me and Slayton. And so at the end, Kippen said, Slayton and I told a lot of jokes, and I'll tell you one, in fact, that I heard originally from Slayton. At the end, Kippen said, "You know, I don't hear that many California Jewish jokes. You know, a lot of this is the Eastern Seaboard, and a lot of this is also, of course, what you call Ashkenazi, that is those jokes that emanated from Eastern Europe and from the distinction of Jews being separated from Eastern Europe." So I told this joke because it really is a California joke in many ways. And in many ways, especially Northern California. When I first heard it, I ran to tell it to Ram Dass, who was a friend, and I still barely keep in touch with. And Peter Coyote, and you'll know why if you know those names, not to name drop. An older Jewish woman, Mrs. Rosenblum, which just happens to be the name of my PR person, signs up for a difficult trek up the Himalayas with a mostly youthful and vigorous Sierra Club type group who are told when they complete the journey to the top, they'll meet a guru. And with an effort that astonishes and amazes all members of the group, and especially its youthful leader, she manages to make it to the top. Once they're all there, the leader tells the group that the guru lives in a cave, which he points to and says right there at the top of the Himalayas. The young leader informs them the guru receives visitors, but please, be advised that you can only say 3 words to him. This is an extraordinary opportunity to be in the presence of, as well as speak any 3 words of your choice to this most revered and venerated guru. Each of the intrepid hikers files in to meet the guru and speak whatever 3 words they wish to utter in his presence. This includes Mrs. Rosenblum. And when she emerges from the cave, the young leader asks her if she saw the guru. "Yes," she replies, "I saw him." The young leader then asks him, "Did you say 3 words to him?" Mrs. Rosenblum replies, "Yes, I said 3 words." And the curious young leader then asks, "May I ask, Mrs. Rosenblum, what those words were?" Mrs. Rosenblum answers, "Sheldon, come home." We have this phenomenon, especially in Northern California. I mentioned Ram Dass and Coyote because Peter Coyote, by the way, now is a Zen priest. This phenomenon of what's called Bagel Buddhism or Jew Buddhism and so forth. A lot of people who were brought up in the Jewish faith who have turned to Buddhism, and it's not necessarily to ridicule that phenomenon. It's just to make you realize that there are Jewish mothers who would like their sons and daughters of them to come home, and to come back to their own identity, to come back to Judaism and so forth. And so there's that whole subtext, really, that I think is unmistakable in a joke like that. And what I was really getting at in this whole book were these subtexts, were the meanings as you unravel the jokes themselves. And I also realized that a lot of this humor goes back really to what we call the shtetl, that is the ghetto of Eastern Europe, the ghettos of Eastern Europe, because there were more than one. For example, there's a classic Jewish joke right out of the shtetl, where two men are going to be executed in a firing squad, which was not, unfortunately, that uncommon for Jews to have to be victimized by. Death by firing squad or other ways. And in this joke, one turns to the other and says, don't we get a last wish because we're just about to be killed? So I'm going to ask for a cigarette. And the other one goes, don't want to get us in trouble. It's a painful joke because it really reflects the difficulty of living in the shtetl, living under the threat of oppressors, anybody who could just take your life at their wish or at their command. Now, fast forward. I'll get to the Bobby Slayton joke, because you fast forward to the present, and there's a joke about a tough New York Jew who is, I love some of the ways these jokes begin. All right, so he's going through the Amazon with a Frenchman and a German. The three of them are together, and they get captured by a band of cannibals, and they're taken into the cannibal village. And there in the cannibal village is a big pot with vegetables boiling and so forth. And a leader steps out. Obviously, the leader of the cannibals is wearing a loincloth. And he says, gentlemen, he says, I'm fluent in English and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. We're cannibals, so we're going to eat you. And we're going to kill you first, and then we're going to take your skin and make it into a beautiful canoe. And I want you to know that because this canoe is going to last for generations among our people and among our tribe. And not only that, but we're going to let you choose the way you want to die because we're very enlightened and humane. And like I said, I was educated in the West. So he starts out with the Frenchman, and the Frenchman says, any way you want to die, just tell us. The Frenchman figures he's got him over a barrel. He says, guillotine. I want to die by the guillotine. Because how could this guy have a guillotine? Well, the leader of the cannibals has a lot of things in his loincloth. He pulls out an axe and he chops off the Frenchman's head, and that's it. Okay? Just to the German, how do you want to die? And the German says, by a Luger. And again, you know, thinking you don't have a Luger. Takes out of his pocket, the leader of cannibals, a gun, and just shoots the German dead. Says to the tough New York Jew, okay, now it's your turn. How do you want to die? And he says, give me a fork. He says, a fork? Yeah, I have some utensils here in my loincloth. Hands him a fork. Tough New York Jew takes a fork, starts stabbing himself. Says, here's your goddamn canoe. There's another version of that that uses the F word. I understand, though, there's a metamorphosis in this. There's a movement, a trajectory, whatever you want to call it. It's like a lot of those jokes out of the shtetl, which are still very funny, many of them. Well, there's a joke about the guy who goes to see a rabbi, and he says, Rabbi, why are so many people so ignorant and so apathetic? The rabbi says, I don't know and I don't care. There's that sort of chicken-boom quality to it that we now find in a lot of contemporary and modern American Jewish jokes. You know, three older Jewish women sitting in a restaurant, and the waiter walks up and says, is anything all right? Some of these jokes give us pause because even though they make us laugh, and though we realize they're kind of the cornerstone of a lot of Jewish American humor, they become second nature to us because most of us, at least, grew up in America or lived in America for a number of years. And Jews have been, as I point out in my book, almost extraordinarily, I'll use a good academic word, hegemonic. They've been dominant in terms of stand-up comedy, in terms of writing comedy. Steve Allen, who was not Jewish, who was actually the first TV talk show host, I believe. Some of you may recall Steve Allen. Man on the Street and all that wonderful stuff. He once decided to take a tally of who was Jewish in the comedy business, that is stand-up or writing comedy and so forth. He came up with a figure of 78%. I don't think it is that high now, but certainly Jewish comics and African American comics have been dominant and remain, to some extent, some of the major figures, you know, Jerry Seinfeld and Chris Rock and so forth. But what I wanted to get was this trajectory. I wanted to get to connecting the dots. And I realized, how many remember Henny Youngman? Most of the folks here, like I said, it's a PBS crowd. Henny Youngman had that same kind of shtick beat to, and I'll give you another example of it, because I had the good fortune of interviewing Isaac Bashevis, a singer, a Nobel Prize-winning Yiddish novelist, a number of years ago. And I said to him, and I was really kind of being serious and solemn at the time, and I said to him, Mr. Singer, do you believe in free will? And he said, I have no choice. there's a whole subtext of philosophy in that, but that's again that chigabum, that kind of rhythm that we get out of the shtetl. So when Eddie Evans says, "Take my wife, please," you know, he's doing that kind of shtick. Or I went to the doctor and the doctor said, "You're sick," and I said, "I want another opinion." He said, "Okay, you're ugly." You know, and where does it wind up? Ultimately, it winds up with figures like Rodney Dangerfield, whose real name, by the way, was Jack Cohen, and who was almost your quintessential schlemiel. I have a whole chapter on schlemiels and schmucks. You don't know what a schlemiel is? You know, Sandy Koufax, maybe the greatest pitcher who ever lived, refused to pitch on. When I was a boy in Cleveland, we called it Yom Kippur, like it was a fish holiday. But, well, called out here in California, Yom Kippur. And he refused to pitch because he was an observant Jew and he didn't want to be pitching, even though it was a World Series game, on this high holiday, pious and tremendously sacred holiday. So Joe Garagiola, who used to be an announcer before that was a catcher for the St. Louis Cardinals, asked Koufax and said, why are you not pitching? It's got something to do with your being Jewish. And he said, yeah, I guess you can say I'm a schlemiel. At which point Garagiola said, a what? And Koufax gave a very cogent and I thought in some ways brilliant description of what a schlemiel is. He just said, you know, in Yiddish folklore, there are schlemiels and there are schlemazzles. Schlemazel means literally bad luck. Schlemiel is the guy who goes into a restaurant, knocks over the soup. The schlemazel is the one that spills out. Okay? So there you have it. And then you also have schmucks. You know, you have all these schmuck-sounding words. And schmuck used to be a word that carried a lot of sort of reprobate negativity to it. Now it's become almost synonymous in some people's minds with schlemiel. And it shouldn't be, because it really meant so many, well, I'll give you an example. And I heard this joke before my book went to press. And I included it though. So there's a guy who dies, and he's known to be a very bad man, or what we used to call a schmuck. Ruthless in business, not even kind to his neighbors or his friends or his fellow Jews, and pretty bad character. And his brother goes to the rabbi, and his brother says to the rabbi, I want you to say at my brother's funeral that he was a mensch, which is one of the highest compliments you can give in Yiddish to someone. That means they're really, used to be just for males. Now it means a really good person, with high standards, high ethics, decency, and so forth, compassion. So I want you to say my brother was a mensch, and I will give $1 million to the capital campaign if you simply say my brother was a mensch. And the rabbi is a good guy, and he's agonizing over this. He goes home to his wife, and he says, hey, this capital campaign has been going on for quite a while. You know, $1 million would put us over the top. It'd be so welcome, and so important. And the wife says, look, you're going to have to make your own decision on this. You're going to have to decide. I don't know what to tell you. So the next day, he gets up in front of the congregation, full congregation, many people like there are here today, and they do often turn out for schmucks. Self-abnegation humor is part of it. He stands up and he says, I have to be honest with all of you. This is not a nice man. This is not a kind man. This is a man who is actually pretty unscrupulous and ruthless and not even nice to people. But compared to his brother, he was a mensch. So I mentioned Rodney Dangerfield. I want to talk about him for a moment because he didn't know. I can't get no respect. That's kind of the quintessence of being a schlemiel. You look down upon yourself, and so forth. And he had, you know, this extraordinary quiver of jokes that all had to do with his own lack of appeal, his own lack of luster, or whatever you want to call it, and lack of respect. So, for example, and again, it goes back to the shtetl. It has the same kind of rhythms, the chigabum that I mentioned before. Rodney Dangerfield would say, for example, I met this woman, she was young and beautiful. She said to me, come to my house tonight, nobody will be there. I went there, nobody was there. Has that kind of beat to it. The other thing that I noticed that went back, in fact, generations really, was something that was a lot more hopeful. And when Scott Simon was good enough to have me on Weekend Edition, he said to me, would you tell the joke about the kid and his father in the middle of the 21st century? And when I tell you the joke, you'll know why Scott Simon asked me to tell the joke. So the joke goes like this. There's a kid, and he's walking with his father. It's the middle of the 21st century. A stranger goes by and says, your son is really handsome. He says, thank you. He says, what's his name? And I says, his name is Shlomo. He says, Shlomo? What kind of name is Shlomo? He said, well, he's named after his dead grandfather, whose name was Scott. Give me the simplicity of that joke on the one hand. Now, Shlomo is right out of the Yiddish experience, anyway. And the reality is that things have gone through a circularity. I mean, there's actually an interest again among some young people in Yiddish, which astonishes me, but also I welcome and so forth. I'll tell you a story, and I tell a lot of them in the book. It happened to me when I was first living in the Bay Area. I was asked by, anybody know the name Alan Bennett? Yeah. He was a rabbi, a gay rabbi. Actually, he came out of the closet to me. He was performing a wedding. And so help me, this is actually the way it went down. He said to me, I want to tell you, because I'm going to come out of the closet. This is mid-70s. He said, I'm gay, and I have a gay... And you know what I said? It was my knee-jerk response. Are you sure? Because at the time, for a rabbi, especially to say, you know, I'm gay, now it's probably commonplace, or something close to it. But at the time, it was a bit of a shock. So Alan asked me, did I want to teach a course at the Jewish Community Center in San Francisco on Brotherhood Way? And he knew I was studying Yiddish writers. And he said, maybe give a course in Yiddish writers. I said, no, nobody's going to sign up for this course, Alan. There's not enough interest in Yiddish writers. And, you know, San Francisco is a Yekka town. It's a German-Jewish town. It's very assimilated. And the truth of the matter is, at the time I was making jokes about, you know, the only Jewish ghetto in San Francisco was Sea Cliff, which is not the same. You know, why, you know, a kid from Ohio, and suddenly I'd see these Jews with Roman numerals after their name. And what's this all about? You know, Junior, the second, and the third, and so forth. Jews named after the dead, like in the joke about Scott. At least they do traditionally in terms of piety. So he said, well, write a sexy introduction to it. And I wrote something foolish, you know. I had some videos, and I said, come learn about Yiddish writers and see Yid vids. And I come into the room, and it's teeming with people. And I can't get over it, you know. And I just really was in disbelief. It was in totally disbelief. And a young woman walked up to me, and she said, Professor Krasny, yes. She said, I'm sorry, just remember, this is the mid-70s. You're in the wrong room. This is a room that Dr. Melvin Kranzler is going to be speaking about creative divorce in. You're in the room across the hall. The room across the hall, and there were like 6 people there. That's the story. So I wanted to integrate some of these stories, and wanted to bring them to bear too. And I also wanted to, one of the longest chapters is on Jewish mothers and grandmothers, but there's also a very long chapter on sex and marriage. And I had indicated that I heard that men's joke before the book went to press. There was another joke I heard before the book went to press, which I thought really needed inclusion. And this is a joke about a rabbi who's giving a sermon, and he sees a young man in the congregation who looks sad. He's a compassionate rabbi, and he goes up to him after the service is over, and he says, forgive me, I don't want to intrude, but you have a sad countenance, a sad, doleful look on your face. Is there something maybe I can help you with, or you can tell me about? The young man said, well, Rabbi, you're very perceptive, and it's kind of you to ask. And the truth is, I am in kind of a sad state. I want to get married. I want to start a family. I've been going online and making dates, and I've actually fallen for a few women. And you know what happens? I bring them home, and my mother doesn't like them. This has happened consecutively with a number of women. I don't know what to do. I'm at wit's end. The rabbi says, look, I've got a suggestion. You can go online now on these dating services and stuff. You can find out all kinds of information about people. Why don't you find some information about someone who has some things in common with your mother? And maybe that'll work for you. And so, he comes back to services 3 weeks later, and he has even a more lugubrious, sad look on his face. So the rabbi, at the end of the service, goes out to him and says, what happened? Did you follow my advice? Yes, I followed your advice, Rabbi. And what happened? He said, I found a woman online who had many interests in common with my mother. I thought they'd have a lot in common, a lot to talk about. Not only that, but it turned out she cooked like my mother, and she even spoke and looked like my mother. And the rabbi said, what was the problem? My father hated her. Well, what do those jokes tell us? They tell us a lot of things. I won't go into the deconstruction of it, but let me just tell you that some of these jokes are hilarious, I think, and I'll tell you one sexual joke that I think is very funny, that has a lot of meaning to it, too. Is that okay? Is anybody going to be offended if I tell it? So, it's another joke about being a rabbi. And in this joke, a couple seem to be sexually dysfunctional because the man is a lot older than the woman is. In fact, there's, let me just divert for a moment. I had a great joke about the older man who marries a younger woman, older Jewish man, and she's upstairs and he's downstairs, and she says, "Come up here and make love to me." And he goes, "What?" She says, "Come up here and make love to me." It's really at the bottom of the stairs. And "What did you say?" And she got a megaphone and said, "Come up here and make love to me." He said, "I can't do both." Or I say this is a classic joke, and I still love it to this day. The man who turns up at the priest's sanctuary at 3 o'clock in the morning, rings the doorbell, the priest comes to the door in his pajamas, and the man says to him, "I'm Isidore Silverman, I'm here to talk to you, Father, about the fact that I have a 29-year-old wife and we make love 6-7 times a day, and at least 2 or 3 times a night." And the priest says, Your name, Mr. Silverman, you're Jewish?" "Yes, of course." He said, "Well, I'm a Catholic priest, why are you telling me?" "I'm telling everybody." So, here's a joke about the guy and his wife who go to the rabbi and they say, "Look, we're having real problems. And it may be the age difference, we're not sure, but it's just not working for us." So, the rabbi said, "I'm going to make a suggestion, and it's going to seem odd to you, but I have a lot of experience in marital counseling, and I think you really might take this under consideration and advisement. You might want to do this." So here's what the rabbi suggests. He says at 5:30 they should, indulge in what the Bible calls knowing each other, carnal relations, marital relations, and leave the door open, like it's done for Elijah. For those of you who know, your Passover services. Say, leave the door open, and a young congregant whose name is Paul will come in, and he'll get completely buck naked, and he'll stand there and he'll wave a towel. And while he's waving the towel, you make love to your wife, and through erotic stimulation and visualization of this young man, she may indeed enjoy the act a lot more than she's been enjoying it. So, Paul's there, he waves the towel. Nothing's happening, zero. Right? They go back to the rabbi the next day. "Rabbi, what happened?" He said, "Nothing. It's just still, no dice." So the rabbi says, "Look, this is going to sound really peculiar and transgressive, but here's what I want you to do. Go home tonight, same time, leave the door open, Paul will come, and I want you to switch places." He says to the husband, "I want you to wave the towel naked, and Paul will make love to your wife." And they're desperate, they don't have any other solutions in mind. This is a rabbi, okay, we'll do it. So they do it. He stands there, the husband waving a towel naked. Paul's making love to his wife. She's in ecstasy, she's yelling, screaming, she's multi-orgasmic. Husband puts down the towel for a moment, goes over and says to Paul in his ear, "That's how you wave a towel." All right, it's a good place to end. It's 2 o'clock. I guess I'm taking questions or jokes or whatever.
You, in your book, had a wonderful story about the young woman who was a tourist in that tough town called New York City. And part of the punchline was, well, before I do, can you tell me how to get to 76th and 5th? But one of my favorite stories about that tough city, New York, is the shtick done by Robert Klein. Did you ever hear that, where he talks about the tough New York City wildlife?
Yeah, I know the bit. In fact, those of you who have Sirius and self-promotion, you can listen to the forum now on Sirius on channel 122. But on 95, there's an all-day, 24-hour comment. Well, not entirely, but they have some guy who talks. They run a lot of Klein in the morning. It's fascinating because they run Klein in the morning along with Kenny Youngman and along with people like David Brenner, a lot of the old-timers. And then you turn it in at night and you hear the young comics. I don't know what that says about diurnal and nocturnal. But the way, the joke you mentioned, New York, by the way, I have a daughter living in New York now. I try to get back as often as I can. It's not so tough as it used to be, by the way. it's softened a lot. But the joke is that a woman from the Midwest turns up in New York and she is kind of can't find her way around. And she goes up to someone, a stranger, and she says, I need directions, I'm kind of lost. Should I go fuck myself or can you tell me and help me? That's, again, that idea of, Lenny Bruce once said that if you're from New York, you're Jewish. It doesn't matter, you know, if you worship at a cathedral, if you worship at a Presbyterian or Methodist church, whatever. You're Jewish just because of the way of life that one is exposed to in New York and the rhythms of life there. He says, on the other hand, if you think you're Jewish and you live in a place like Wyoming or Montana, it doesn't matter, even if you go to a synagogue, you're not Jewish. That was that curious kind of bifurcation that Lenny Bruce had. And there's a lot of that in my book. Jackie Mason made a whole career out of, going on Broadway and saying, this is Jewish, this is Goyish, meaning, Gentile or not Jewish. And using stereotypes, of course, for the most part. Jackie Mason would say, I know a guy, he's half Polish, he's half Jewish, he's a custodian, but he owns the building. I know a guy, he's half Italian, he's half Jewish, he can't get it wholesale, he steals it. I mean, there's a lot of people who are uncomfortable with these kind of jokes, just like a lot of the Jewish jokes would be remiss if I didn't say, create discomfort. A lot of Jews will say, those are only jokes that Jews should tell each other, or they're kind of border on anti-Semitism, or I get into this in the book because it's an important dimension of it. But I think the point is what's funny. And what I've realized now, I had an interview, some of you may have heard just a few weeks ago, with John Cleese of Monty Python. And he said he can't do the college campuses anymore. And he was saying this with great deal of regret and lament, because there's so much political correctness that for him to use the kind of humor that he's applied all these years just doesn't work. And Seinfeld and Chris Rock both said the same thing. It's become exceedingly difficult to do the kind of humor that was once second nature. I mean, a lot of this stuff just wouldn't even be a part of what we now call contemporary humor, because it's not acceptable. But some of it is still hilarious. That's the kind of thing you're navigating here.
So the shtick by Robert Klein about New York City wildlife starts off with those guys fishing in the East River. Can you imagine what kind of bulldog monster fish they would catch if they actually caught something? The fish would come out of the water and say, give me that bait. Get that damn hook out of my mouth. What do you think that tickles, you moron? Been ducking tugboats all these years? Are you from out of town, you rube?
Well told. I mean, you have that kind of New York punch to it. Thank you for that. Robert Klein's a very funny man, yes.
Getting back to the Jewish mother, these jokes are for the son and not for the daughter. And so this one is, the mother gives her son 2 ties, and he comes to the door, and she looks at, she said, you didn't like the other one?
Thank you for telling that again, well told. It's in my book, and I'll tell you what I did in this book with that joke and some other jokes was paired with a real story. Many of you know the name Reed Abrams, who wrote the Mill Valley song, actually. Reed Abrams, who does these cabaret type of theater events and everything. Well, we go back a long way. I like to say we studied the birds and the bees together because in Cleveland we were in a biology class together, so it's literally true. But Rita told me the story of her grandmother taking her to the movie theater and saying, get some popcorn. She said, Bubby, her grandmother, I don't want any popcorn. She said, no, get some popcorn. And she's really pushing her to get the popcorn. And I don't really, yes, get popcorn. All right, so she gets popcorn. They see the movie, they go out to dinner. Her grandmother says to her, you're not eating anything. She says, yeah. She says, that's because of all that popcorn you had. It's the same type of joke, really, with the 2 ties.
So I have a joke and a question. The joke is a Jewish mother joke, and it also is a cross-cultural joke. So it's the difference between an Italian mother and a Jewish mother. The Italian mother says, you eat that food or I'm going to kill you. The Jewish mother says, you eat that food or I'll kill myself.
It's a wonderful joke, and a lot of them wound up on the cutting room floor, and I'm sorry to say that was one of them. I'm at the stage of my life now where it's, and I'm sad to say this, I've heard most of them, and I like to tell them, and I still like to hear them. That's the wonderful thing about this kind of humor.
Can I ask a question? The question was, who was your favorite Jewish comedian that you've interviewed and why?
Well, I had the good fortune of interviewing some terrific Jewish comedians. I did interview Jackie Mason, who came in I had seen him the night before. He came in and I said, I really meant this sincerely. I said, you know, your performance struck me as being so well timed. You must go through a lot of calibrating just the timing you do. You know, the night before. He said, word for word, verbatim. He said, this is the stupidest thing that anybody has ever said to me in my life. He said that I, a great comic, a genius of my sort, would have to go through rehearsals and have to work on my timing. This is great. So the interview's over, and I said, thank you, Mr. Mason. Of course you enjoyed yourself. You had me here for an hour, you didn't spend a nickel. That was amazing. I also interviewed at the College of Marin, at the KCC of Marin, and some of you may be familiar, Alan King, who I always thought was a genius in many ways. You know, I think that joke, that famous joke, was his originally, about the 7 words that, and it really doesn't make sense when you take it apart and deconstruct it, that summarize all Jewish holidays. They try to kill us, we want, let's eat. And it was definitely his joke to say that somebody opens a Chinese fortune cookie and looks within it and says, help, I'm a prisoner in a Chinese fortune cookie factory, which also has an analog to a mezuzah opening up and saying, help, I'm a prisoner in a mezuzah factory. But I started doing some research on Alan King, and I found something that made me laugh out loud, and it's so silly, and yet I had to put it in the book. Alan King performed for Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip at Windsor Castle. And when the performance was over, they both went backstage to meet him, and the Queen said to him, it's such a pleasure to meet you, Mr. King, and he said, it's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Queen. Silly, but silly was good, right? Certainly, one of the most memorable interviews I had was with Joan Rivers. And by that time, Joan Rivers had moved into some pretty blue and scorching material. I mean, Joan Rivers started out as one of these self-lacerating women who would talk about, I once made Isabel Allende laugh so hard she was actually unable to control herself. By telling her this, it was a Joan Rivers joke about the woman who, obviously an older woman, who was trying to wear open-toed shoes to show off her breast. When Joan Rivers was younger, when she started telling those jokes still when she was younger, she would say, you know, they take new photos of me and they give them to these prisoners on death row so they wouldn't be aroused, and they'd be looking for them, have to worry about giving them saltpeter or anything to keep down their sex drive. She was, in many ways, brilliant, and there are a lot of these young women comics, Sarah Silverman and Chelsea Handler and Amy Schumer, who stand on her shoulders. I love the Sarah Silverman line, by the way, about my sister actually was with 2 men in one night. Can you imagine? She could hardly walk. 2 dinners in one night? So, I'm interviewing Joan Rivers, and she said something that I did not, again, decided I couldn't include in the book. It was a joke that she felt she couldn't tell. And she was at that stage where she was, you know, there were no boundaries. There was nothing to keep her back from making fun of just about everybody on a TV show of hers, and even herself, of course. And yet, she told me a joke that happened to be one of the writers wrote for her that she felt she couldn't tell, and it was about Michelle Obama, and I won't tell you the joke. She told it to me off air. But it was fascinating because when we were finished with the interview, this was in the KQED studios over on Mariposa in the city, there was a whole line of women. There must have been at least 40 or 50 of them who worked upstairs in all kinds of capacities for KQED, television, radio, and so forth. And as she walked by, they just all bowed to her. I mean, it was really kind of touching in a way, the testament. But I talk about these. I talk about my interview with Gene Wilder. I talk about a number of interviews I did with famous comedians, and they're all memorable in different ways. For better or worse, I'm more associated with serious news stories. And I often think of the line of the great German playwright Bertolt Brecht, who said, "The man who laughs has not yet been told the terrible news." But I honestly wanted to write a book that was funny and that celebrated humor, and did.